So tonight we're going to cover the longest chapter in Esther and the shortest chapter in Esther. One is 32 verses and the other one's only 3 verses. And Esther chapter 10 is one of the shortest chapters in the whole Bible. And it's just a few verses, but it gives the exaltation of Mordecai at the end. So let's first of all begin with a review of what we said last time. So Esther's second banquet, that becomes Haman's last supper. So she revealed her true Jewish identity and that the Jews were her people. So now this powerful secret is out of who she is and who she's identified with. She also reveals that her life is in danger and there's an enemy that's plotting her destruction and the destruction of her people. Of course, this shocks the king. How in the world would anybody dare to touch my wife, my most beautiful bride of all the women he had? She was number one. But he's shocked. How would anybody dare to do this? And who would have the audacity to do this? And little does he know that it happens to be the guy that's sitting right next to him. Happens to be his right-hand man, happens to be the second most powerful man in the whole Persian Empire, happens to be his prime minister, happens to be the guy that's been coming along to this banquet, both banquets, the whole time. And so, as you know, the king had already decided what he was going to do to Haman, and he ended up hanging him right in front of his own house. And that was just a real grisly scene. But just because Haman is dead, the decree that Haman made is not dead, and the plot thickens. The story is not over. Esther then reveals to the king Mordecai, the very person who saved his life, he is also a Jew. So Esther, the wife's a Jew, the guy that saved your life is a Jew, and all these other people that are getting ready to be destroyed by this decree are all Jews. So this king now is surrounded by Jewish influence and Jewish people. So the king gives Haman's entire estate to Esther, and Esther ends up giving it to Mordecai. So again, Haman is dead, but the decree is alive. And how do you revoke an irrevocable decree? A decree that cannot be altered, a decree that cannot be changed. And Esther was relying on the king to tell her what she ought to do. And so that's when he tells both Mordecai and Esther, you need to issue another decree, write in it whatever you think. And now Mordecai has to come up with what kind of decree am I going to put out that will counter this other decree. So that required the wisdom of God to be able to do that. So Mordecai's decree allows the Jews for just one day to defend themselves against those who hate them. And the decree, of course, got sent out to all the provinces of the Persian Empire. And once again, we see the hand of God in it all because we here go all the way back to the dice, the rolling of the dice. If God had not allowed that dice to roll so that it would be almost 12 months from when the dice were rolled, the Jews would not have had time to arm themselves. The Jews would not have, by the time the information got to all the provinces, it would have been too late. They would have all been killed. So God allowed it to give them plenty of time so that they could get ready to fight against those who were going to come against them. So now that Mordecai's in power, there's rejoicing, there's feasting. Even Gentiles become Jews, which is something totally unheard of in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. And now the fear of Mordecai and the fear of the Jews is gripping the whole people of this empire. Isn't that something that the Jewish people now have become like the top dog over the whole Persian Empire, and people are afraid of them. So that's an amazing story, an amazing turn of events. And but we're still not done because we got to deal with this decree. Let's go ahead and start by reading the 2 decrees, because this is where this titanic clash hits now in Esther chapter 9. So let's go back and read, and I know those of you who've been doing the homework, you've been answering the questions about these 2 decrees. Esther chapter 3, In verse 12, this is Haman's decree. And then we're going to go to Esther chapter 8 and read Mordecai's decree. And then the clash begins there in Esther 9. Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month. And a decree was written according to, notice this, all that Haman commanded. So Haman's the one that commanded it. It was written to the satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to their script, and to every people in their language. And notice how this was written. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus. It was written and it was sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces. And here's the wording that Esther and also Mordecai are going to use: to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women. And in one day, he wanted it all in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and also to plunder all their possessions. All right? This decree was commanded by Haman, verse 12, and it was in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed in his signet ring. And then right here in verse 15, we notice that it's called the king's command. Okay, the king's command. So now if we go over to Esther chapter 8, verse 9, we're going to look at Mordecai's decree. And it is amazing how the similarity of wording is there between the two decrees and the whole thing about scripts and sending it off and going to all the provinces, etc. So Esther chapter 8, verse 9, the longest verse in the Bible, is, so the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, which is June, on the 23rd day, and it was written, notice this, according to all that Mordecai commanded. To the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote, here it is again, in the name of King Ahasuerus. He sealed it with the king's signet ring, and he sent letters by couriers to on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. Now, let's keep reading to verse 13 here. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives. Here it is again, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. And how long was it for? On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. And we'll notice once again, the next verse says, it's the king's command. So exactly the same. Haman's command, Mordecai's command. It was in the name of King Ahasuerus. It was in the name of King Ahasuerus. It was sealed with this king's signet ring. It was sealed with the king's signet ring. It was called the king's command, and it was called the king's command. So you have these two decrees coming now, and the D-Day, the day that it's all going to come to the head, is the very first verse of chapter 9. So it says, now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, which is March, on the 13th day, the time came for whose command is it? The king's command. It was given by Haman, but it became the king's command because it was sealed with his signet ring and it was in his name, and his decree to be executed. So that was the day. What happened on December 7th, 1941? You guys remember? Pearl Harbor. What happened on Pearl Harbor Day? What happened on that day? You guys remember? The Japanese submarines and aircraft carrier aircraft came and attacked Pearl Harbor. So that day, as the president said, was a day that would live in infamy, and it has. We all know right away. He just said December 7th. You guys knew right away, right? What happened on June 6th, 1944? Maybe a little bit less. No, June 6th, 1944. You guys remember? No? June 6th, 1944. Something happened. No? They different armies came from south of England to the coast of Normandy and invaded to come against Nazi Germany, right? So it was D-Day. That was D-Day. Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, that's where all the Americans landed. So 5 different beach fronts were taken. So most people know June 6, 1944 was D-Day. That was D-Day. So we all know that day, right? So what happened on August 6, 1945? August 6, 1945. August 9th, 1945. Yeah, those were the atomic bomb dates, right? So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were August 6th, August 9th. What happened on September 11th, 2001? All you have to say is 9/11, right? You know the date. Well, this was the date, March 3rd, 13th, and we know the year too pretty accurately. It's 474 BC. March 13th, 474 BC was D-Day. It was the day that this thing was supposed to be out to destroy all the Jews. And so let's look here. Let's go ahead and finish reading here the first 5 verses. So the date is given there when it should be executed. It says, on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred. I love that. The NIV says the tables were turned, basically. In that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. And this is a very important phrase. The Jews gathered together. It keeps saying that over and over. They gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them because the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Wow. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man, Mordecai, became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and with destruction. And they did did what they pleased with those who hated them. So this was a Friday the 13th, right? This was a day, an ominous day that was planned by Haman to destroy all of them. We've already covered that it was commanded by these 2 men. It was signed and sealed by the king. And in one day, isn't that amazing how evil Haman's plan was? He wanted them all executed on one day. And because Mordecai, I believe, didn't want it to be too much of a slaughter, he gave them only one day to defend themselves that particular day, which was the 13th day of the 12th month. So this was a terrible situation, and now they're going to have to defend themselves. Okay, let me find my notes here. I didn't flip this right way here. Sorry. So they're going to go here from being victims to being victors. The ones who are going to fall are not them, it's going to be their enemies. The Jews are the ones that are going to be standing. And what we're going to see as you look at chapter 9 is you're going to see this wording over and over, with Haman being the enemy of the Jews, and it's going to use that phrase, the enemies. Verse 1, verse 5, verse 16 twice, verse 22, it talks about the enemies of the Jews. There, Pastor Rick asked a really good question. Who were they? Well, we don't know. It doesn't say. It never identifies who they are. We know, of course, Haman was the main one. His sons would also be included in this. And in verse 1, at the end of verse 1, it describes them as those who hated them. And at the end of verse 5, it says those who hated them. So that's how they're identified, enemies and those who hated them. But what they had planned, Haman had planned, and what these enemies had planned, all got turned around. And we see in verse 1, they overpowered them. We see also in verse 2, they laid hands on these people who sought to hurt them. No one was able to withstand them. Verse 2, verse 5, it says they defeated them, they slaughtered them, they destroyed them. And it's amazing how much help they got. Even all the satraps, the governors, the leaders, the princes from the whole Persian Empire started helping the Jews. I believe it's clear that it was because Mordecai was in such a prominent and powerful position now as the number 2 guy. He kind of became Joseph in Egypt and Daniel in Babylon. He becomes the person who's the most powerful governing person there in the whole Persian Empire other than the king. So as you read the next verses then from 6 to 14, we begin to get a report on how these people are being killed, who's being killed. And the focus in these verses from 6 down to 14 is what's happening in the capital, in Shushan. And apparently there were a lot of enemies there. And so the initial report is, verse 6, that the Jews ended up killing and destroying 500 men. And once again, we got to go back to saying, it doesn't say little children, it doesn't say women, it says men. It always says men when it talks about who the ones that are killed. It then lists all 10 of Haman's sons. They also were all killed. Verse 7 through 9 lists them, and then it says at the end of verse 9 that they were all killed. Excuse me. Then what happened was, the king gets a report of how many people got killed by the Jews there in verse 11 and 12. And he tells Esther, apparently Esther's out of the loop on the totals. He tells Esther, okay, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men. Is there anything else you want? And it just almost seems surreal that he's telling her this. What do you want? What's your petition now? What's your request now? It'll be done. And what she asks the king in verse 13 and 14 is she asks that the Jews can do again tomorrow what they did today on the 13th. So, in other words, she says, give us another day because there's more enemies. And one of the things Esther wants to do on this next day is she wants to publicly hang all of Haman's sons. And the Bible doesn't say why, but some of the commentators, and I kind of agree with them, I think she wanted to make a statement. This is what's going to happen to you if you come against the Jews, if you start messing with the Jews. And so Mordecai's decree was only valid for one day, and so the king in verse 14 approves Esther's request to allow the Jews to fight another day. And that's what happens in verse 15. The next day, on the 14th day of the month of Adar, they end up killing 300 more men. So a total of 800 men are killed just in the capital city. And they hang all of Haman's sons. It's not known. We do know that Haman's sons were killed in verse 9 on the 13th day. And it appears that Haman's sons get hanged on the next day, and that's why people wonder when did all that happen. It seems like this is overkill. They're already dead. Why hang them? And again, it had to have been a public statement that they're having to make because they're already dead. Why do you need to hang them again? It's like overkill. But that's what Esther requested. And by the way, a lot of people try to impose Christian morals on Esther. She was not acting as an individual Jew taking revenge on people. She was acting as a queen over the Persian Empire. So she was kind of in an official capacity making these statements to the king. So it was not just her own revenge. Haman boasted about these very sons that unfortunately they were all hanged. And this painting actually was done by a French artist in 1996. He painted this, showing all of Haman's sons hanging from the gallows, the same gallows that Haman hung from and the one that he had built for Mordecai. So again, Queen Esther was acting as the queen over the empire. She was not a personal revenge with her, although probably she felt good that Haman was gone. That's for sure. One of the things that of course I've learned a lot from studying Esther, but one of the things that I've found out about myself in reading the Bible is that sometimes we just will read a date, or we'll read some people's names, or we'll read a number of people killed, and we don't really stop and think about what actually happened, right? We kind of just read through, and Esther is a classic book. You know, if you don't sit there and read these dates, you can't tell the distance, the time frame between them all. But I got to thinking how many people were actually killed on one day by the Jewish people. And it really blew my mind. So I want to give you a comparison so you can get a feel for what happened on that day, March 13th. So I thought, what was a bloody war? Well, World War I was a bloody war. I mean, that was the most it was the most disastrous carnage of all time. Was that World War I in the trenches there in France, where literally millions of people were slaughtered in World War I. That millions of people. And when those people came home from Britain and England and France, literally certain sections of France and Germany, England, the whole generation was gone. Wow. They didn't come. There was no. It was a fatherless generation, and that's why Europe, that particular area of Europe, is so rebellious and dead against God. I mean, they lost their fathers, grandfathers, family members by the millions. I mean, it was a total carnage. World War II, it just began to become even worse than that. Where 50, 60, 70 million people died in World War II. Millions and millions of people. But here, when we want to talk about bloody, terrible carnage, we always look to the Civil War. That there's no doubt about it. The Civil War was a terrible, terrible battle for over 4 years, where the casualties were incredible, and each battle got worse. Grant and Lee, these generals, they said, okay, it can't get any worse than this. And a few months later, it was even worse, the next battle, so it was just a terrible, terrible thing. And so I took the 10 bloodiest Civil War battles, okay? And we'll start from the one that was the least to the one that was the most, Gettysburg. So Fredericksburg, and in parentheses, I put how many days it was. It was 5 days. This includes Union and Confederate people that were killed. The number of casualties was way more. People were wounded. But the number of people killed, Confederate and Union, was 1,692. And the next one was Stone River's battle. It was 3 days long. Almost 3,000 people got killed. Second Bull Run was 3 days. It was more than 3,000. Chancellorsville was 7 days, 3,271. Shiloh, and that was the one where it was so terrible that Grant could not even handle it. He was caught asleep. They said he was drunk when the Confederates attacked. And 3,485 people died in that battle in 2 days. Antietam was a one-day battle. 3,675 people died. Wilderness battles, it was 3 days, 3,700. Chickamauga was 3 days, almost 4,000 people died. Spotsylvania courthouse was 14 days, over 4,240 died. Gettysburg was the worst of all the battles. 3 days, over 7,000. In fact, they don't even know how many Confederates died. They have no numbers. There's still thousands of people that are missing. They don't know what happened to them. They don't know whether they left or they died or what happened to them. But there were over 50,000 casualties in 3 days. And so the slaughter at Gettysburg was horrendous. It was horrific. You add all those up, the 10 bloodiest Civil War battles, 37,122 people died in those battles. But just think about it. The Jews killed in one day 75,500 people. In one day. They killed more in one day, twice as many than what happened in the Civil War. So you get a kind of a feel for how terrible this was for these enemies. Multiply that times 2 and you get almost 75,000. And then just think of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these atomic bombs, how instantly people, 45 to 60,000 people were killed in one day. The rest of the people from all the radiation poisoning that came over several months, you have tens of thousands of people. But even the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, that didn't kill that many people that the Jews killed in one day. So it was a slaughter. I mean, it was a slaughter that the Jews, and the Bible tells us here that they used swords. Verse 5. It was slaughter and destruction. And just think of, Haman must have been turning in his grave to know that this was happening. But it allows you to almost, nobody can fathom how that all was, that 75,500 people, and then an extra 300 got killed the next day. Cannot be fathomed what actually took place in the Persian Empire on that one day, March 13th. What's interesting, and I don't know why, we are not told the casualties among the Jews. Obviously, there had to be some Jews that got killed in that, but we're never given a total for what happened to the Jews. I don't think it was somebody who could say, nobody got killed. I don't think so. I think a lot of Jews were killed too. Perhaps thousands and thousands of Jews got killed. But we're never given that total. We're only told how many died among the enemies. So, again, don't want to glance over verse 16, where it says there that 75,000 of these enemies got killed in one day. And then you add the 500 from the capital, and you have a very, very high number. What is amazing, too, is now the next day, the Jewish people that were fighting in the outer provinces, they killed 75,000 people, and the next day they were feasting and celebrating. They were resting because their enemies had been defeated, and they started celebrating. Well, because Esther had given this decree to fight another day in Shushan, and they killed 300 more people, the Jews in Shushan didn't celebrate until the 15th day. So the 13th and then the 14th they celebrated, but the people in Shushan had to fight for 2 days, so they couldn't celebrate till the 15th. And so those become then the 2 days. The 14th and the 15th become the 2 days of the Feast of Purim. That's why it became a 2-day feast. So all the Jews in the outer provinces celebrated on the 14th, and the Jews in Shushan celebrated on the 15th because they had to fight a whole nother day. And you see that as you begin to read here in verse 17. They'll start saying that they did this on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th they rested, and they turned it into a day of feasting and gladness. Same thing happened then with the Jews in Shushan, verse 18. So they assembled together on the 13th. They had to do it also on the 14th. And then it was on the 15th that they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So that's how we end up with that. So a total of 75,000, then 800 people were killed. And one of the important things that they make note of, as you're going to see at the bottom of this slide here, they say they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So once they killed all of these 500 people and all Haman's sons, it ends in verse 10, they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Once they killed the 300 the next day, verse 15 says they did not lay their hand on the plunder. Once they killed all those 75,000, in verse 16 it says they did not lay their hand on the plunder. Even though Mordecai's decree matched word for word what Haman's decree said, if you go back to chapter 8 and verse 11, you'll see the last statement was they were given authorization to plunder their possessions. So they held back. They wanted to make it not something personal like a revenge. This was the wrath of God on the enemies. This was God's doing, and so they were not going to lay their hands on the plunder. And that goes back all the way, if you think about it, to what happened with Saul, who laid his hands on the plunder, and he kept stuff that he shouldn't have. He should have annihilated everybody, and he didn't do it. But here they're showing that, hey, they were restrained. The Jewish people were restrained. They were not making it a personal revenge. They were leaving the people's plunder alone. So, starting with verse 20, you begin to see this feast now established. Mordecai, in verse 20 all the way down to verse 28, Mordecai establishes this feast. He gives the whole the writer here, the author, whoever wrote this book, gives us the background, how it was that they established these yearly celebrations on the 14th and the 15th days of Adar, which is verse 21. And it showed how the Jews got rest from all their enemies. And I love verse 22. It kind of just it summarizes what actually happened. That as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which they turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So that's what became this whole thing. And so think about how profound the turnaround is. A day when the Jews were going to be exterminated, annihilated, it ended up being the next 2 days of just celebrating and rejoicing. And the Jews have been doing this now for 2,500 years almost. They've been celebrating what God did with Mordecai and Esther and the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. So man, God knows how to really turn it around. And so this is a very powerful statement of God's delivering hand. So as you know, the Persian Empire was very much ruled by decrees and laws, and things had to be written down. And you see that as you read these verses here, verses 20 through 28. And I'm going to read it here. Mordecai wrote these things. He sent letters to establish the custom which they had begun. As Mordecai had written them, he commanded by letter because of all the words of this letter and according to the written instructions. So I extracted all that wording from these verses here because everything was written down so that the Jews and their descendants forever would celebrate this feast of Purim. So things went from bad to good for the Jews, but for Haman it went from good to bad. Everything returned upon his own head, verse 25 says. And there's a song that the Jews sing on the Feast of Purim where they said, the world was amazed that Haman's poor became our Purim. Haman's lot ended up becoming our day of feasting. And isn't that true about how the Lord works with us too? He turns around what was meant for evil for good. Joseph, of course, the classic example, but what the enemy planned for bad, God turned it around for good. And that's powerful. We can always trust in that. Okay, let's go to the next one. So Haman's wicked plot backfired. And what he planned to do to the Jews, to consume them, annihilate them, came on their enemies. And the result being that in verse 25 there, Haman and his sons were hanged on these gallows that had been made for Mordecai. So, remember what happened, right? In chapter 3, these sorcerers always threw dice as a means of divination or sorcery. They always believed that the gods were in charge of how the dice rolled, and they believed that they believed in demonic spirits and stuff to control the roll of the dice. And so that's where we get Purim, right? So the word pur means a one die, and Purim is plural, the dice, so that's why it became the Feast of Purim, the Feast of the Lots, or the dice, the rolling of the dice. Purim, the I-M at the end, is just like adding an S for us in English, or an ES. It makes it plural. So if you see a seraph is one angelic being a seraphim, cherub is one angelic being cherubim, Ephraim, Elohim, even God's name is plural gods, Gerizim, Zuboim, Mahanaim, the Urim and the Thummim, all those words, when you see the I-M there at the end, they all mean plural, the plural version of them. So the Purim is the casting of the lots. That turned into a feast for the Jews. There were these 2 days, the 14th and the 15th day of Adar. Now what happens is Mordecai is the one that writes this whole thing out. You can read that in verse 23. Mordecai had written to them. And it was Mordecai's words that were established there in verses 20 through 28. So now in verses 29 through 32, the last 3 verses, it's Esther who now writes another letter to confirm what Mordecai just wrote. So this is going to become the key word there in verses 29 through 32. You're going to see the word confirm in verse 29. You're going to see the word confirm in in verse 31. And you're going to see the word confirmed in verse 32. So Mordecai wrote it all out, but then Esther confirms it because she's the queen. And so if you read verse 29, the queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. Also verse 31, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Esther the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed them. And so finally, this decree, verse 32, becomes known as the Decree of Esther, which confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So again, they like to write, verse 29. They like to write. Everything gets put into books. Everything gets written down for the Persian Empire. So Esther confirms what Mordecai did. We know that it was Queen Esther that wrote this, because when you look at verse 29, it says, then Queen Esther, and then it says, with Mordecai the Jew, but then it says wrote. You see that word there, wrote, with full authority? That verb there is a feminine verb. And if it had been Mordecai that wrote it, it would have been a masculine verb. And so it's not. It's a feminine verb. So Queen Esther was the one who wrote this. Mordecai happened to be just there seeing what she was writing down. And it became known as Esther's decree. So there's that song. I love it. All the world was struck with amazement when Haman's pur became our Purim. So his casting of lots ended up resulting in a feast for the Jews that they sing even to this day. One of the things that lady will bring out in the YouTube video, if you watch it, is she emphasizes how important it is to rejoice and to be glad and to be feasting and celebrating. And that's what happened here, is that this turned into a feast, a celebration feast. And it's sad today that secular Jews all over the world turn it into it's a Mardi Gras, it's a party, getting drunk, and all that, and they turned it around from what it used to be. The ultra-Orthodox Jews and the Hasidic Jews, like in New York and stuff, they celebrate it properly, and they send gifts to one another, and they send gifts to the poor and so on. But the worldly Jews, which is a great percentage of them, they're out doing crazy partying things. There's even YouTube videos that talk about how to get drunk on the Feast of Purim. But that's not what they had intended, obviously, for them to do. It was a time to be celebrating and rejoicing. And you guys know that the Jewish people, when it comes to celebrating, they know how to get down. They know how to really do it. The Jews also know how to mourn. They know how to wail. They know how to sit in sackcloth and ashes. The Jewish people are very expressive people. And so when they celebrate, they celebrate. And some of the even Orthodox Jewish celebrations that you can see on YouTube, they are dancing around and just really rejoicing, and they make special breads, breads of Esther and all that. It's really a powerful thing. So as we move from what happened here, we go from the longest chapter to the shortest one. And here we see an element also that we should emphasize here, and that is what happened to Mordecai. Because if you remember in the very beginning, from starting with chapter 3, when Haman shows up in the scene, Mordecai is the guy who's despised. He's the guy who's hated. And Mordecai never pushes himself forward. He was always concerned about how Esther was doing, but he never tried to grab for government power. He never tried to push his name forward. He never tried to ask the king, hey, by the way, I saved your life. Aren't you going to give me something for this? He never did any of that, and yet we see how exalted he became and how powerful he became. And verse 2 talks about it, starting with verse 2. Now all the acts of his power and his might, it's talking about the king, verse 1, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, how the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews, and he was well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace, shalom, to all of his countrymen. So as we go back and we read chapters 8, 9, and 10, and we see how highly exalted Mordecai was, it's a powerful statement of humility on him, how God exalted him, and how this guy, who was a Jew now, is the number 2 man over the whole Persian Empire. That is a very powerful conclusion to all of this. Haman's destruction turns into a feasting for Jews. Who Haman wanted dead is now really the most powerful guy in the whole empire. And also Esther is the queen over this whole empire. So it's a very powerful ending for us. So I'm thinking next year, when I find out the dates on the Feast of Purim, because sometimes they celebrate it in February or in March, I think we ought to celebrate it as a church. We'll just celebrate it, throw a big party here at the church, have a big potluck, and we'll read sections of the book of Esther to the whole congregation and let them know that we should prepare ourselves for the persecution that's going to come. We need to know that God is going to deliver us. Whether it means being delivered here or Jesus coming, we're going to be delivered. We know we already have this. And so we will celebrate with the Jews the Feast of Purim. And so let's do that next year and read this story at the potluck as we're feasting. And send a gift to your pastor, too, while you're at it. It said you can send gifts to one another, right? And maybe even talks about giving gifts to the poor. Maybe we could identify a ministry or somebody who's ministering to the poor and bless those people. And just turn it into a joyful, that's what it is. It's a joyful, celebratory time. And once again, we're kind of thumbing our nose at Haman, the whole time. That he wanted all of this to go down bad for the Jewish people, and even us today at Clovis Christian Center, we're going to be celebrating the Feast of Purim. So, all right, so that ends the class here on Esther.